some listeners commenting about our last show. Later on in the broadcast, I'll give out the number so that you can leave a voicemail if you don't get to call in, but you can always comment on our stories on our website. That's WMNF.org/news. You can also join the conversation on Twitter or Facebook. That's at WMNF News. And our guest today is Laila Abdelaziz. She's the Legislative and Government Affairs Director at CAIR-Florida. That's the Council on American Islamic Relations. She's also a board member here at WMNF. Welcome back to MidPoint, Laila.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
And we did just have you on the show 4 weeks ago, and that's not typical, but there are some updates to some of the bills that we talked about then. And during this show, we'll also talk about a disturbing incident that happened to you in the state capitol on Thursday. But before we get to that, let's set the scene that day. What was the bill that you were lobbying against in Tallahassee that you called anti-refugee, and where does it stand in the House and Senate?
So there is currently a bill in the state legislature that seeks to put refugees and immigrants, not just refugees and immigrants in the state of Florida under a FDLE, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, watch list and grant the state authority to deem whether refugees or immigrants are quote-unquote restricted persons, and technically grant the governor and state authority to deport these people if they are deemed restricted persons. There's also a provision in the legislation that creates an exemption for refugees and immigrants from the Western Hemisphere, so it specifically targets refugees and immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere, and we think that this is, we don't think, we know because of the bill sponsor's language himself and his own rhetoric and the rhetoric that's been used to justify this legislation in the state capitol, which is, to target Syrian refugees and to associate Syrian refugees with a national security threat.
So we have a bill in the Tallahassee legislature that's essentially taking the job of immigration and refugee status and
well, this is important. This is an important note because immigration policy has been has been proven time and time again to be strictly the uniform responsibility of the federal government, and there's a lot of logistical reasons. There's a lot of international trade and treaty reasons. You just have to have uniform law as a country, as a nation, and the Supreme Court has found that to be the case, especially after the 2010 Arizona law that passed in the state of Arizona. It was challenged, taken to the Supreme Court, and a lot of provisions in this anti-refugee bill are similar to provisions that were placed in the Arizona bill, such as granting state law enforcement the authority to target individuals. These are law-abiding individuals. These are individuals that have not broken any laws, but would have to undergo a state background check that the individuals themselves have to pay for as well. Like the cost is also on the refugee or immigrant being stripped of their due process rights, stripped of their constitutional rights, simply because of their national origin.
2 weeks ago or so, there was a conference in St. Petersburg about world affairs, and one of the sections that I covered had to do with refugees and whether the Syrian refugees are dangerous, which is the whole premise of this bill. And unanimous, at least among the invited speakers, was that there's so much protections, there's so many steps that a refugee has to go through that, and I think Samantha Bee also did a show about,
it was great.
about this. That it's almost ludicrous that you would be worried about Syrian refugees because refugees are the most screened type of immigrant.
So the refugee visa is the most scrutinized visa for any individual that eventually lands and finds themselves in the United States. And it's a process, the refugee screening process involves about 5 federal law enforcement agencies. It involves international agencies. It involves in-field, one-on-one, in-person interviews. And Syrian refugees and Iraqi refugees actually have an enhanced screening process on top of the very thorough screening process that refugees have to go through. So it's, experts that are familiar with the process, with the screening process, definitely say that this is a very thorough process and it's a process that we should trust. And instead of creating this environment where we're, using fear to divide communities and to associate communities or people because of their national origin with threats to our national security, I think that's very un-American, and I think that it creates and fosters very unhealthy community climates.
And we're going to talk about how that climate is negative nationally and also something specific that happened to you. But before we get to that, let's talk about what the committee hearing was like on Thursday. What were some of the sponsors and supporters of this bill saying, and where does it stand?
So it was interesting, kind of in a bizarre way, because the legislators themselves were saying, admittedly on the record, that this seems to be an unconstitutional measure. And the bill sponsor and several of the supporters that chimed in had said that they're afraid and they're fearful, and that is why they're trying to send this message to the federal government, and so they're going to support it anyway because they are fearful. And the chairman of the committee himself actually, on the record ended up saying, I can't support this measure. I mean, this seems to be an unconstitutional measure. And he didn't end up supporting it. It did pass, unfortunately, very narrowly. I think we missed the vote by 1 or 2 members. And so now it'll move on to the House floor for a vote with all the members of the Florida House.
So that was its last committee stop. It'll go to a House floor. Presumably, since it's passed through all the committees, it could be close, but it's likely to vote along mostly party lines, I guess, on the House floor. What about in the Senate?
It has not moved in the Senate. We are, we're definitely trying to educate members of the legislature about the refugee screening process and trying to educate them about the actual provisions in this legislation and why we think this legislation is very discriminatory and just not the right direction for the state of Florida to be passing laws that wouldn't pass constitutional muster.
And the name of this bill is the Prevention of Acts of War. I mean, that sounds very...
There's political rhetoric. How are you supposed to vote against that,
yeah. I mean, I want to prevent acts of war. Heck,
everyone
where do I sign up?
Everyone wants to prevent acts of war, and I think that's, that's kind of the read between the lines messaging of it. You have the bill is called Prevention of Acts of War. It includes words like invaders and conquering the state of Florida and restricted persons. It specifically is encouraging law enforcement to profile individuals based on their national origin, which is a discriminatory process. The Department of Justice's federal guidelines have now indicated that profiling individuals because of their national origin actually makes us less safe, and it is an un-American thing to do.
One of the sponsors, or the sponsor, I'm not sure, Lake Ray, he has on his Facebook page, he has a short video of himself talking about why he supports the bill. So let's go to Lake Ray.
Hi, I'm Lake Ray, Council Representatives District 12 out of Jacksonville.
This is short.
I'm here to talk to you
And
about something
it's not
very
inflammatory, so maybe...
It's really simple. It's about giving the state an opportunity to have a background check on these unknown refugees that may be coming in, posing threats to you, me, your families, and our economy. It will be a disaster to our
You want to go right to it, or do you want me to?
Disney World,
Go ahead.
or Universal Studios, or any one of these were hit and attacked like what happened in San Bernardino. You can't afford it, I can't afford it, we can't afford it, let alone the risk to our families. House Bill 1095, I need your support. Contact your legislators and senators for their support. Thank you.
So that's Lake Ray, a Republican from the Jacksonville area. He is the sponsor of this Prevention of Acts of War bill.
So, what we're seeing from Representative Ray time and time again is he keeps saying that this offers the state the opportunity to know who these unknown individuals are that are coming into our state. And the entire premise of that is just fundamentally flawed, because we know exactly who these individuals are. It's just, just entirely not true that there are Syrian refugees coming into the state of Florida that are not screened by the federal government, that have not gone through 18 to 24 months of a very thorough screening process. And it's frustrating because Representative Ray is not trying to figure out what is the federal government doing, and how can the state help the federal government do what it's doing and what it should continue doing. We should absolutely worry about our national security. We should absolutely thoroughly screen individuals that want to receive any visa of any kind to enter the United States. And I think it's very, it's very obstructionist to tell the entire state of Florida that the federal government is not doing this thing.
Our guest is Laila Abdelaziz. She's Legislative and Government Affairs Director at CAIR-Florida. My name is Seán. I'm the host of MidPoint Monday. It's 12:21 in the afternoon, and we'd like to hear what you think about this issue. The number is 813-239-9663. You can email your question or comment to dj@wmnf.org. You can text us at 813-433-0885. And the reason we're talking about this issue today is because of something that's pretty shocking that happened to you on Thursday. You spent the day listening to the committee that you were talking about and maybe speaking against the bill, and then you tried to get into an elevator, and I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, so directly after the committee where they passed this anti-refugee measure, I had gotten into an elevator with several members of the Florida House. These are all elected officials that were in that committee. And we were leaving the floor, and another member of the Florida House was entering the elevator. And as he entered the elevator, he kind of jokingly hesitated as he got in, and he said to me, "Oh, is it safe to ride an elevator with you?" And yeah.
And it's not something where, it's not, you weren't a stranger to him, and he was nervous about something. He knows you personally, right? I mean, you've had interactions with him, and let's call it, I'm going to say his name because you've told me and you've told Huffington Post. This is Representative Tom Goodson, who is a Titusville Republican, and
Representative Goodson represents a district where there was a mosque that was recently vandalized. You know, I work at the Council on American Islamic Relations. We've seen such a significantly concerning spike in hate incidents targeting Muslim Americans because there is this fear, there is this misunderstanding, there is this mischaracterization that Muslim Americans, that the Muslim global population, and that Islam itself is a violent religion, which, you know, we absolutely push back against. Muslims are law-abiding, peace-loving people. And for Representative Goodson to make a remark at me, you know, knowing that I'm a Muslim American woman, knowing that I work for the Council on American Islamic Relations, that, you know, he for some reason should fear being in an elevator with me because I am a threat to him. I mean, it's very concerning, and it's very frustrating because this is an elected official that's making very serious decisions on behalf of a very diverse state. And to me, that tells me that Representative Goodson is not in touch with what's happening in his own district, is not in touch with the dangerous implications of making these kinds of jokes at somebody's expense. And, you know, I mean, women in elevators have no shortage of uncomfortable situations and scenarios with men, so it was like a lot of levels of frustration that I was feeling because an elected official that had just voted for this bill, knowing that it's most likely unconstitutional, and then enters this elevator with me and makes that kind of remark, it's, you know, wildly inappropriate.
And just so everyone knows, I did call Representative Goodson's Tallahassee office and his Titusville office. I left voicemails inviting him on the show. I've not heard back from him, but maybe we'll get a call during the show. And just, I want to be crystal clear from what you said on Facebook. He was attempting to make a joke, right? I mean, it's not like
he did say it in a joking way. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but that doesn't excuse it. I think from your point of view, I think that's part of what you're upset about.
Yeah, I mean, it's not funny. It's not funny to make a joke at someone's expense. It's not funny to, you know, to just put it out there verbally and in public with other people around, other elected public officials in the area, and say that, you know, he's admitting that he has this belief that Muslim Americans, that people that follow the Muslim faith, that Islam is inherently violent and he should fear people that are Muslims.
Either he has that belief or he thinks it's okay to joke about having that belief. And just as...
But didn't his vote kind of insinuate whether he has that belief or not, you know?
I won't answer that. I'll let people mull that over. It almost as upsetting as him saying that is the reaction that you described the other legislators that were in the elevator. What happened?
The other legislators laughed, and it was a very uncomfortable moment for me because I'd like to think that in a moment where someone was made fun of or someone was bullied or someone was, you know, a joke was made at someone's expense, that I would step in and say that that's not funny and you owe that person an apology. And I'd like to think that even, I did think that as an individual that can hold her own, I have thick skin, that I myself would have done that in that situation. But when you're, it's this weird environment where you are the other, you're not them, and these are voting members of the Florida House, these are publicly elected officials, and Floridians deserve better, whether they're Muslim Americans or not. This is the third most populous state in the nation, and it's one of the most diverse states in the nation, and we should have public officials that are aware of the challenges and the phobias and the bigotry in their districts.
Who else was in the elevator?
They were all members of the State Affairs Committee. I won't name them.
You won't give their names?
No.
All right, so the State Affairs Committee of the the Florida House of Representatives. Well, I had to ask. I knew you weren't going to answer me, but I had to ask anyway. 813-239-9663 or dj@wmnf.org. Let's go to the phones. Mike has been holding for a while. Hi, Mike in Tampa.
What's wrong with that?
Turn us down a little bit.
So that's a great point,
And this is from a question that someone earlier
Thanks,
said.
Mike. Yeah, so Colin Powell one time.
Thanks for the call, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. This reminds me of an interview that Colin Powell did when President Obama was receiving a lot of pushback from groups because people were associating him with Islam and being Muslim. And Colin Powell said, on national TV, so what if President Obama is Muslim? That is what it means to be an American. It is to be inclusive and respect everyone for their faith, for their ethnicity, for their race, regardless of who they are or what the color of their skin is or what faith practice they associate themselves with.
And for people who had just tuned in during the last show, maybe about a half an hour ago, there was a caller who called in and was upset that Rob was attacking Donald Trump, I think is what his claim was, and that that maybe that because Obama carries around a Quran all over the place, that's something that should be examined.
Does he?
Well,
Does
that's what the caller said, and Rob certainly challenged him on it, and I can't say I've ever heard that before. It's a new one to me. It seems to me very unlikely.
Well, this caller should take a look at Thomas Jefferson's Quran. Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers who drafted many of our country's founding documents, had a Quran that it's on display in Washington, D.C., and it's something that our country is proud of. They're proud that our founding fathers, referenced theological textbooks and academic and philosophical textbooks of all backgrounds, of all times of history, and this is all rooted in this very intentional fear that individuals, groups, politicians have instilled in a certain segment of our country's society, that Islam and the West are mutually exclusive, that there is something inherently violent about the Muslim faith. And as someone who was raised in a diverse faith background and as someone that has studied the Quran, I encourage anyone to read the Quran. And I think what most people will see if they read it with an open mind is that the Quran actually has a phenomenally just war theory, phenomenally advanced just war theory. It's a peace-loving.
What's just war?
Self-defense, I would argue, for example, and when are you allowed to engage in warfare? When are you not allowed to engage in warfare? I think that studying Prophet Muhammad and studying the history upon the context of what was Arabia when Islam and Prophet Muhammad were when Prophet Muhammad received what Muslims believe to be the message from God, which is the Quran, and just I think most people are hearing these talking points from people that have very intentional agendas to divide our communities, to instill fear in people, and I think it's very misguided and unfortunate.
You brought up Thomas Jefferson's Quran. Is this the same book that Keith Ellison, the first Muslim member of Congress, was sworn into office using that
Yes,
Quran?
he did use that Quran.
We're speaking with Laila Abdelaziz. She is legislative and government